Thank you, Bob. I really appreciate your pointing out that for me, I do this work with the bees out of a love for the bees and beekeeping. I do like to find aspects of the bees' biology that really are not only fascinating in themselves about the bees, but have some practical significance. And that's one of the features of what I'll be talking about today. Before I do that talk, though, I do want to express my thanks to a number of people, especially the organizers of the National Honey Show and the Central Association of Beekeepers. I know that you've long been supporting and publishing reports on research for beekeepers, but especially Roger Patterson, who invited me here and enabled me to make connections back again, the wonderful special pleasure of connecting with folks from England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Ireland. It really is special for a Yank to come over and see you guys again. Great. You know, I wasn't clear on whether, but now I am. I knew Wales is there, but I didn't. I get it. It really is exciting to be a bee researcher. It's very exciting to make discoveries about the bees, but it's also, I have to say, icing on the cake to share those discoveries with others. Whatever I've learned about these ever fascinating insects, there's really no point in making the discoveries, I suppose, unless the information is shared, for one thing. Good. So let's look today, what I want to share with you now is this whole aspect of what I like to call the thirst of a hive, how honeybee colonies control their water collection. This is a topic that doesn't get much attention. Water is, on the one hand, it's maybe a small part of the economy of a colony, but of course, as we all know, as living creatures, living systems ourselves, the water economy of any organism is fundamental to its survival. And that's really true with the honeybees as well. So we'll look at how the colonies control its water intake. I showed this slide to put in perspective that water is always being collected by colonies. What this slide shows is the results of sitting by a hive for 5 days, and I steadily captured all day long for those 5 days. I'd grab a returning forager, and I would squeeze her abdomen and have her regurgitate, if she had material in her honey stomach, regurgitate what she had onto a refractometer, and then I take a reading of the sugar concentration. And you can see here that most of the bees were bringing in nectar, somewhere in the range of about 15% up to about 65%. And this was, I want to emphasize, this was in May, middle of May, and where I was, this was when the dandelions were in bloom. So no surprise that there was a lot of nectar being collected. But also what did surprise me was that there was a small percentage of the returning bees that were bringing back water. And the reason that surprised me is because there's all this liquid, all this watery nectar coming in, and yet bees were still collecting water. And so there was those bees, and those bees that I later learned, this is back in 1985, since then I've learned that the water collectors are water collector specialists. The bees that are doing that, they're really focused on water, and when there's not a need for water, they sit quietly in the hive, ready to be activated for water collection when it's needed. And that need can be very unpredictable. It depends on what the air temperature, whether the sun starts shining on the hive, and so forth. So they're specialists, they're ready and waiting, and the question we face and they face is when to start and when to stop their special activity. Just as a curious point before we get into it, when do you think colonies become the most thirsty? Spring, late winter. Yeah, it is the winter. And why is that? It's because there's a lot of times they can't, at least where I live, deep winter, they can't get out and get water. And I mentioned this yesterday. I keep an observation hive in my office and through the year. And the thirstiest bees I have seen are bees in January. One year, this is a hive that's in a heated room, and so they don't have condensation in the hive. They get terribly thirsty, so much so that if I squirt a little water in the hive in January, they go nuts. And I don't do that because then they rush outside thinking that somebody's been collecting water. The most vigorous waggle dances I've ever seen, where bees did hundreds of circuits, were water collectors on a January thaw. When they were able to go out and get water. So that's the most thirsty condition that I've ever seen for a colony, and paradoxically, in the middle of winter. So these are the two main questions we're going to look at. Why do bees collect water, and what creates a thirsty colony? Well, the first person to give a really rigorous look at this was the gentleman shown here, Martin Lindauer. Back in the 1950s. You can see in that picture, I hope over there on the left, you can see that what he's tending there is a little water source. It's, you can see that his water is collected. It was outside his house at home, and his water source was a milk can filled with water, and he's got a little siphon, and that he's got a little valve on the end of the tube coming out of the milk can. Water's coming out through the siphon, and then it's trickling across that tray where he's got a flat surface with some sticks and some moss, and he had bees collecting water there. This was a study he was doing on the water economy of a colony. And he did a couple of studies, various studies, and one of them is shown there in the middle panel, where we can see that he was looking at how bees turn up their water collection when they need to cool the hive. That wasn't surprising, but it was a very nice documentation. What he had here was a little colony in an observation hive, and initially the heat was off. He didn't have any heat going onto that hive, but then he turned on his heater, and this temperature here is the temperature in the area around the hive. And when he so it started out 20 degrees, and then it went up to over 35, 37 degrees with the heater on. And you'll notice that, and this is the water collection, number of water collecting trips of bees to a water source he had in the laboratory per 15 minutes. And you can see it takes a while for the water collection to turn on. It heats up quickly, but the water collection, there's a lag. And then when he turns the heat off, then the water collection very quickly drops down. So clearly, one of the needs they have for water is to cool the hive. And we all know that the amount of energy that's required to cause water to go from liquid to vapor is a lot, and that's why it's such a good cooling material. So they use the water to cool their hive. But also, very importantly, and this is where in the spring, many people were thinking about probably this, and they're starting to rear their brood, they also need water to make the brood food by the nurse bees, their glands. And this can be, the problems here in the spring can be acute as well. So people that were thinking about spring, right on. And Lindauer did a study where he again had bees coming to his little water collector now it's in April. And when the days were warm enough, above 15 degrees centigrade, bees, he noticed how many water collectors, and this reflects how many different individuals. He would individually label his water collectors. So he knew how many different individuals on each day came to his little water source. And you can see as long as it was above 15 degrees, they came along nicely. But then the cold spell set in, where the temperatures went down to 10 and below 10 degrees centigrade. The water collectors couldn't come, and they got very thirsty. And then on this day, when they were getting desperate, and they were just barely able to come out, and he got this surge of water collectors. Almost 60 bees were engaged in water collection that day. And it was so cold that day that some of them got stuck at the water source. They drank the cold water, couldn't fly home, but he picked them up and breathe on them and help them get back to the hive. Nice guy, very nice gentleman. And then you can see it got warm again, and they kept going with their water collection. So both the condition of needing to cool the hive and to prepare the brood food are the two main uses or needs for water. But interestingly, these are two very different situations that's driving the need. To cool the hive, it's a matter of high water loss. They're burning through water, and thus they collected it there. In this surge of water collection on those cold days, it was because they had a low water intake. They just couldn't get the water. So High water need can arise either because the colony is losing a lot of water, or it's using some water, but it just can't get water. That both, we can understand personally, both situations can lead to thirst. Now, I want to talk generally about the organization of the colony's water economy, because it's different. It's got an interesting difference from nectar, and I'll highlight that. So basically, there's an outside hive component to the economy. It's the water source, and that's what's visited by the water collectors. The water collectors are like foragers. They work outside, then they come into the hive, usually, and offload their water near the entrance, just like the nectar collectors. They regurgitate their fluid to bees working inside the hive. And we'll call these water receivers. And again, like with the nectar collecting, the water collectors are elderly bees, generally 20 plus days old. The water receivers are generally in the age range of 10 to 20 days old. And then they take their water and they'll pass it out to other adult bees, or they'll put it on the combs for cooling. They'll even put some around the brood cells if those are overheating. Now, the thing about at least I find interesting about water, the control of water collection, is it's driven by variation in consumption rate, either for cooling or for making the brood food. So the demand for water goes up and down as the temperature changes and the amount of brood in the colony changes. But the water supply outside the hive is basically flat. It's steady and it's high. There's usually water, it's little streams or whatever. So that's just the opposite from nectar collection, where on the nectar economy of the colony, the supply jumps around from day to day and hour to hour as the flowers come in and out of bloom and the weather changes. But the demand for nectar is always high. They're always trying to get more nectar to fill their honeycomb. So the control is opposite. It's a demand-driven part of the bee's economy. Yeah. And we'll see why that's so important, thinking about demand drive. Just want to emphasize, there's, again, a division of labor that's really important between there's the water collectors and then the water receivers, and they connect up just inside the nest. And this just repeats what I said. Variation in water collection reflects variation in demand, unlike nectar, which variation varies with the supply. Okay, here's a pretty picture of a water collector. It's one of my favorite pictures of a bee. You can see it's standing on duckweed, and collecting water can be dangerous for bees. If they can fall into the water, if they go to the edge of a lake and there's waves and it's a windy day, they can get caught in the water. So I think this bee's found a good, safe place to get it. She can land a light on the duckweed and put out her tongue and load up. Isn't that a pretty picture? I like the colors too. Okay, let's just review the structures involved to being a water collector and where the water is carried home. It's carried home in the crop, and this is a nice diagram from Snodgrass, I think. It shows the crop, this organ here. It's shown much better, actually, in this one, where the bees she's loaded up with nectar or water. You can see how extensible the crop is, and how, just if you measure, and I've done this, you very carefully weigh the bees empty and then weigh them when they're full with water. You find that a full crop a bee's carrying home a good 50 microliters. That doesn't sound like a lot, but that will double the weight of the bee. That 50 milligrams can just about double the weight of an empty worker bee. So that's a big deal. And each one of those, just to know what's 50 microliters, well, convert it to teaspoons, it's 250th of a teaspoon. And so so each load of water is a small amount, though not small compared to a bee, but they can do it over and over again, and it adds up, as we'll see. Okay, just another nice picture, or pretty picture of the exchange, and hammer home that there's this transfer process between the water collector with her bulging abdomen, and that bulge, again, comes from the crop. It's that front portion of the abdomen, or is extended. And here's our little water receiver. I like this because she's got a stubby little abdomen in comparison to the water collector, and her tongue is out. And it's just, aren't they the just cutest insects, the bees? They just have nice proportions, I think. Okay. And one thing that I'm not going to talk much about this, but it is an interesting thing we learned recently in some of the experiments I'll share with you, is that bees do store water. We know they store pollen and nectar, but it's little recognized that they can store water. And this is an example, and it's stored in the body of the water receivers. And it's only done at the end of a day of high water stress. Here's an example. Day one, and I'll show you how we get these data in a little bit. We've got a hive. Basically, it's in a greenhouse where we can control the water collection, the water availability. And on day one, in this particular experiment, the hive, at the end of the day, these data represent, at the end of the day, on day one, we opened up our observation hive, which we were as our study unit, and we plucked out bees just from the hive, not foragers, but hive bees. And this was on day one. This black light bulb means that was a day when the hive was not heated and was not put into a water stress. And it was also a day when this blue raindrop means that water was plentiful, was available all day long. And if you open up the hive and you, again, sample the contents of bees that look like they have extended abdomens, you find that all of those hive bees are really holding sugar solutions in their crops. It's somewhere between 40% sugar and all the way up to almost honey, over 80%. So that's what you see on that day. But that was a day without a water stress, both because there was no heating of the hive and water was available if they wanted to collect it. Now, day two, which was actually just the next day, was a day where we heated the hive, and I'll show you how this worked. But we did provide water. We still provided water, but it gave them a water stress. And to my surprise, when we did the same sampling at the end of that evening, this was done around 7 p.m., a lot of the bees in the hive also had water in them. So this very watery liquid in their crops, 0 to 20%. And of course, many of them still had the more concentrated materials. But this was interesting. Now, if you resample that bees when we resampled that bees in that hive the next morning, all this watery material, we didn't see this anymore. They evidently had brought in this water, had stored it in their bodies, and probably maybe having that stored there was part of the recovery from the water stress or the heat stress they'd experienced during the day. So they can temporarily store water in their nests, but they don't put it in cells. We sampled the cells. We've never seen water stored in cells, though possibly that does happen as well, but we didn't see that, just in the bodies. Okay. This makes a point I mentioned already. Water collectors are the older bees, 20 plus. Water receivers or spreaders are the middle-aged bees. And this is a water receiver that's shown here. She's gone up to she's in the brood nest. This was during a time when the brood nest of a hive was being overheated, and she was cooling the brood by putting a droplet of water in the cells, the roofs of the cells. And that was a drawing, yeah. Now these water receivers, the handlers of the water in the hive, are really important to this story. And I want to share with you a little timeline. This is just one of these water receivers that I tracked in the course of my studies of the water collection process. What we see is we're going to follow this. This is a record of this bee's activity through one cycle as she received and then she distributed a load of water. During this time, the hive was being heated. So the colony was collecting water, and the water receivers were working hard to use the water that the water collectors had brought home. So we start here. I started my observations when I saw the water receiver unloading a water collector. And I don't know who the water receivers are until I see them receiving water from a labeled water collector. So that's why time zero is when I see a bee taking water from a water collector. And she received water for 19 seconds. And then what did she do? Well, then she started walking. And after about 10 seconds, She spent about 15 seconds giving water to a hive mate, but she didn't give up all her water to the hive mate because then she kept going. And she would go from cell to cell around in the brood nest. Each of these little dots means inspect a cell. She would poke her head down in the cell just for a second and then go on. Finally, she found a cell, evidently, which was probably, she sensed that inside that cell things were a little too warm. So she smeared water in the cell. You might wonder, how do you tell if a bee is smearing water in a cell? It's because she doesn't go all the way in the cell. She puts her head in, and then she rotates around in the cell. That's distinctive for either spreading nectar, or if it's a nectar receiver, or in this case, spreading water by a water receiver. And what did she do then? Then she went on for a little bit longer. She didn't, again, spend about 10 seconds in there doing that. Then she walked on, looked in more cells, found another hive mate to whom she gave water, did that with another hive mate. Then she kept looking in cells, found another hive mate to give water. I don't know how she decides whether she's begged by a hive mate or not, but she was giving up water. And you could see that because the hive mate would put out her tongue and between the mouth parts of the water receiver and getting water. Then she kept checking cells. Finally, she found another cell where she again smeared water for about 15 seconds. Then she checked more cells. Then she gave up more water to more other hive mates. And then she was done. And now she walked back. She walked back to where she would get more water, and she started receiving another load of water, which took her another 28 seconds. And then, so she was doing this over and over. So that is the work, just a glimpse at the work habits of being a water receiver bee. And take-home message here is these water receivers can be very busy bees, especially if their hive is overheating, and that imperils the brood. Okay, here are the two key questions we're going to address from here on out. How does a water collector, so we're going to shift over to the water collectors. How does a water collector know when to start collecting water? And how does she know when to stop collecting water? So start and stop. So let's start with the first one. What stimulates a water collector to start fetching water? And the way we looked at this was we would observe water collectors inside a hive when the colony's thirst was gradually raised from low to high. So we could watch the initiation of the water collection, of the activation of the water collectors in a colony. And you'll see how I know who the water collectors are, because on the previous day we've put a heat stress on the colony, we've labeled the bees that are going to a water source, so we know on the day of these investigations which bees are the water collectors. And then we see what changes this water collector experiences as her colony's thirst goes from low in the morning to high as we put the heat stress on the colony. Here's the location where we do this. It's not a very glamorous location. It's inside a glass house at Cornell University. It's actually right at my bee lab. That's really handy. And the young woman shown here is Maddie Ostwald. She was doing her senior honors project with the bees. And I'm happy to say, like many students, has gone on to do graduate studies with the bees. She's at Arizona State University. And so that's like Heather Madela, that's a name to keep in your mind. Heather Madela, Maddie Ostwald. These are brilliant researchers. Okay, Maddie. Okay, so, and what we've got, we're doing this in the glass house. Why do you think we're doing it in the glass house? Gives you complete control of the water source. They can't get water except for the water source that we provide. Here is the water source down here. It's a little, I'll show you a close-up of it in a second. It's a little water dish, and it's mounted on scales. And here's the two-frame observation hive containing the colony of bees. The lower comb is the brood comb, the upper comb is a honey storage comb. And there's a lamp here, heat lamp, so we can overheat the brood nest. And this hive is equipped with a bunch of little thermocouples, so we can precisely record temperatures at various locations, both outside the hive and various locations inside the hive. Okay. Here's the water source. And the reason I show this, because I want to stress that this water source is mounted on scales. Now, why do you think we put it on scales? know how much we can take. You can measure the take-up of water much more precisely by measuring the weight change of your water source than by trying to read a meniscus in a container. So we put it on scale so we can measure very precisely the water collection. And you can see the little water collectors down there on the collecting water. So the basic logic of what some of the experiments we did, or the experiment I'm going to share with you now, is as follows. We heat the brood nest of the colony in the observation hive. We leave the glass on, so it's almost like being in a little oven there, and the light is heating the dark combs. So we heat the brood nest, and we're going to measure the following things: the temperature in the brood nest over the course of several hours. We're going to measure the temperature in the brood nest. We're going to measure the number of water collectors. We're going to do that we'll see, every 30 minutes. Each of the water collectors are labeled for individual identification, so we know exactly how many different individuals are going to the water source at each stage of the experiment. We're going to measure the rate of water collection by taking readings every 30 minutes of the drop in the weight of the water vessel. And most importantly, we're going to be looking at the behavior of the water collectors inside the hive. Not the water receivers, but the water collectors, because the question here is, how do the water collectors know when to start collecting water? We're going to start this experiment when there's no need for water. We're not heating the brood nest of the hive. They've had water, they've had plentiful water, but now we're going to give them a heat stress. We're going to see what changes in their behavior. Because again, the question is, what turns them on to collect water? Now, here are the results. It's a complicated diagram, so we're going to go through this in care. Day one, as you can see, is a control day. There's no water stress on the colony on day one. And you can see that there's no water stress by looking at the temperatures. That top blue line is the temperature of the brood nest. And I think you can see it never gets above 35 degrees centigrade inside the hive. And so no heat stress that day. Everything's hunky-dory. Is that an expression you use? Hunky-dory? Okay, good. So I want to make sure we're on. Our shared language doesn't separate us. Okay. So temperature, no water, temperature's stable and not stressful for the colony that day. You can see the water collector's behavior. Now, it's maybe a little hard to see this, but the line to pay attention to on that water collector behavior, the most important line is the thick black line, and that corresponds to her getting begged for water. And what is begging for a water look like? It means a bee comes up to the water collector, and the bee that comes up to her puts out her tongue between the mouth parts of the water collector. That's diagnostic of being begged for fluid. So there's a black line, thick black line that codes getting begged. There's a thin blue line up at the top, which just means she's standing around. So throughout this day one of the control, she's spending a lot of time just standing around. She's not getting begged at all. And the red line is her walking around. So she's doing a little walking. Mostly she's standing around, not getting begged. So this is a quiet day for her. She didn't have much to do. And the number of collectors refers to how many distinct bees showed up at the water source that day. And you can see it's flat-lined at 0. No water collectors went to the water source that day. The next thing down is the time that the colony took to drink a droplet of water. This is 50 microliters, 250 microliters that was squirted into the hive on the floor of the hive. And this was our way of measuring the colony's thirst level. When the colony's thirsty, bees will just pile onto that 250 microliter droplet of water and suck it up in seconds. But on this day, the control day, you can see that water droplet, 0.2 milliliters, was just sat there for the full 300 seconds or 5 minutes. Wasn't drunk, wasn't needed. And the water collected, the amount of water collected per 15 minutes from the water source was, again, flat lines at 0. So that was a day when the colony did not have a water stress. The important thing is what happens on day 2, which is the treatment day. And again, we're going to look at this, the code of what the treatment is represented up here. So day 1, the heating lamp was off, black bulb, and water was plentifully available. Day 2 starts out the same situation as the control day, no stress on the colony. No heat lamp is off, water's plentiful. And you can see things, the colony's temperature is stable, is normal, not stressful. The water collector's behavior is the same as before. She's not getting begged, she's standing around. And what do we have here? Number of collectors is low. Bees are not drinking the droplet that's been squirted into the hive every 30 minutes, and there's no water being collected. Now, here's where things get interesting. Things start to change. We're giving them a double stress. We're turning on the heat lamp, and we're taking away the water. That's about as bad as it gets. Both the demand for water is going up and the supply has been erased. So we're putting the colony into a stress. Now and as you can see, the temperature inside the nest is going up now. Now it's getting dangerous. The temperature in the brood nest up here in this dark line up here is up above 40 degrees. That's serious, seriously bad. And what else do we see is happening? Well, we see that it takes, interestingly, there's not an immediate activation of the begging of the water collector. It actually takes, there's time units here, this is an hour. It takes more than a half an hour before she starts to get begged. And, but the temperature in the nest, but she starts to move around more. So there's a lag about after half an hour where this black arrow is. She starts to get begged, she starts moving around. And we see that also after that half hour, the number of collectors starts to go up. Now, these are bees that are going out to the water source, so I can count how many of them there are. They're not getting any water, but they're starting to show up at the water source. And the colony's getting thirsty. As soon as we put the droplet in, the bees start drinking it. And we know this is making it crystal clear the bees are getting very thirsty in the hive. But there's no water available for them to collect, so the water collectors, per 15 minutes, the number of bees actively sucking up water stays 0. And so the colony is getting pretty stressed out. And you can see we put them in that situation for 2 hours, from 10 in the morning till noon. And then, so something has changed about this water collector's behavior in here. But then when we finally provide the water, we turn off the lamp and we provide the water. So we eliminate the stress. Note what happens. They get the temperature in the brood nest back down rather quickly. And the water collector, she is collecting. She's getting begged heavily, but then the begging goes down as the stress passes. The number of collectors, though, does stay high for a long time. And the water collection stays high. Even when even after the lamp has been off for 2 hours, they're still collecting water. Why was that? They had been in that 2 hour of stress had evidently left them in a water deficit. So they kept collecting for a while. But eventually their thirst did dissipate. They started to get slower and slower in drinking up the water droplet that was put in the hive. So it took them about 2 hours or a bit more to recover from this water stress. The key thing here, let's see if I show it on the next slide. These are the key things to note here. When this brood nest overheated, and where focus is on the water collector, she got begged, gets begged more, she walks around more, and she makes visits to the water source, more visits to the water source. So somehow she knew, even though she was not involved in spreading the water, she was being activated to go out and try to collect water. But what was actually stimulating her is the question. Why? One of the most striking changes was this begging. And so why were these water collectors getting begged more often when their colony's need for water is high? Well, the answer to that was pretty simple. There are more bees seeking water when the need is high because more bees are working as water spreaders to cool the brood nest. And so I think what it looks like goes on is the colony overheats, the water spreaders, it's their job to cope with that overheating. For about an hour, they can do a good job of coping with that. They controlled the water, the comb temperatures for about an hour using the fluids they had in their body And so for about an hour, the water collectors weren't being begged. But once the water spreaders had used up the water they had, then they went down to the area near the entrance and started begging the water collectors. And again, just remind ourselves, water collectors are these elderly bees, our water spreaders are these middle-aged bees. So, coming back to the question, so how does a water collector know when to start collecting water? It's either that she's responding to being begged more strongly by the water spreaders, or she senses by herself that she's becoming more thirsty because she's giving up her water. Maybe she feels that her crop is now empty, and she knows that's not a good situation to be in if you're a water collector. Or she senses the combination of both things. And I can't tell you whether it's the begging per se or the personal thirst per se or the combination of the two. Possibly she's sensing both things. But clearly her situation, even though she's not involved in cooling the nest directly, her situation changes by being begged more and being emptied of what water she has in her honey stomach. What I want to turn to now is, okay, so now the water collector has been activated. How does she know when to stop collecting water? And the bees have to do both of these water collectors have to do both things, when to start and when to stop. This study was done in a more pleasant situation because we didn't need to control the water sources in quite the same way. This was done at this Cranberry Lake Biological Station. This is this 9,000 plus square mile Adirondack Park. And the virtue of going up here is there's no forage for honeybees. But most importantly, we went here, and what that means is there are no wild colonies in this far north. It's just too heavily forested. That means when we take a study colony up to the Cranberry Lake Biological Station, we're the only bees. We're the only source of bees. And this means that if I take a colony of bees up here and I run it through its paces of collecting water, I can work with bees that are going out to natural water sources because I know that if I see a bee on the water, and in fact we'll see, as you'll see shortly, our water collectors go to the shoreline here, I know that they're coming from the study colony. So we can again label the water collectors. Just one colony of bees, but water's everywhere. You might think, wow, that's a dumb place to go to do studies of water collection because the bees could go everywhere to get water. But again, though, as it turns out, when water collectors usually go to the nearest water sources. And so for this study, it involved taking up the same two-frame observation hive. That's a convenient size to work with. And I took along two assistants. These are two girls that came over from Germany that summer and wanted to work with the bees, Susanne Kuhnholz and Anja Weidenmuller. And they were great assistants, and you needed two of them because the data collection at the OBS hive was pretty intense. One person had to monitor bees coming in and keep track of the rate at which water collectors were going, while the other person followed one water collector at a time to get behavioral data. And this gives a sense of the layout up here. That orange square is where the orange hut is that houses the observation hive, and those two X's mark places along the lake shore there where we found water collectors going. So what we did to get this whole thing started is we'd heat the brood nest with a colony in the OBS hive with a lamp, and then we just walked along the shoreline of the lake looking for water collectors. And when we found them, we could put a dot of paint on them so we could have them individually identifiable. And the amazing thing about water collectors, maybe you've seen this yourself, is just incredible site fidelity. That water collector that you see there on that pebble, that's where she would go every time, to that pebble. She'd land on that pebble and reach over and put her tongue into the smear of water in the mud there. And it's just breathtaking. Some of them would go to a particular tuft of moss or whatever. That said, it's fairly dangerous work to collect water from a shoreline like that, because if a wave comes in, then, as I say, the bee can get stuck in the water. But they're good at judging that. They tend to collect the water back from the edge. And just incredible site fidelity, which was very handy because it meant we could if we wanted to track individuals, we could watch both at the hive or at the bee's little spot, her water spot. I really like working with the bees when you have such a personal relationship to individual bees too. Because they're all different. They've all got their personalities. Some are hard workers, back and forth, and some don't have that work ethic. Okay, so what I'm going to take you through now is the results of one of these, same colony, but two different trials, because they give slightly different results, which is actually interesting. What we've got plotted here, and these are plots where the point here I'm going to show you is how well the colonies have an adaptive control of their water intake. They can turn it up when they need to, and they can turn it down when they need to. And so the water collectors are turning on and off their activity as needed. Let's walk through the top diagram. Okay, timeline along the bottom. So it's starting around noon and it runs into the evening through 1300, 1500, beyond into 1700 hours. Now, what's plotted here, there is a temperature line indicated by these little stars, and there's a period where the heating lamp is on. And so and then there's another, so that's the temperature in the hive, this line here. This line with the black dots is the line of the number of water collectors per minute coming into the hive. Water collectors per minute coming into the hive. And then there's another line connecting white open dots. Those are the number of nectar collectors coming into the hive per minute. And how do I know they're nectar collectors? Because well, they're not really nectar collectors, they're sugar water collectors. Because not only do we have the hive, we have bees collecting water, but I've trained bees to go to a feeder, to a sugar water feeder. And those bees are labeled too. So we can see how many of our labeled bees coming in from the feeder are coming into the hive. So we can measure the rate at which nectar, because that's the only nectar they can get up there is from the feeder, are coming into the hive and the water collectors. And you can see that in this experiment, it starts with the heating lamps off. And when the heating lamps are off, the temperature in the brood nest is in the normal range, between 33 and 36 degrees centigrade. Then we turn the heating lamps on, and the temperature in the brood nest goes up. It goes up to over 40 degrees, even to above 42 degrees. That's a serious overheating, of course. And initially, when the heating lamps are off, we can see there's no water collectors. No, they're not active. They've been active the previous day. They've been labeled, but they're not they're not leaving the hive and going out and bringing back water. And also, there wasn't much nectar collecting initially either. Now, what happens then? But the heating lamps are on, and again, there's a lag. But after a while, is indicated by the black dotted line, the water collectors start to engage. And by the end of this 2-hour time period, as you can see, there's 6 or 7 bees, water collectors per minute coming into the hive. It's a small colony, so it's not a massive traffic, but that's every minute, 6 or 7 bees coming into the hive. And then the water collectors, even when the lamp is off, their level, the rate of their activity is high for a while, but once the lamp has been off for 2 hours, the water collection goes down to 0. So they've turned the water collecting on, and they've turned it off. The nectar collecting, they stays low, gets a little bit higher during the day, but it doesn't go through this jump and go down. It just kind of does its own thing. The next time we did it, we basically saw the same thing. Heating lamp off, temperatures in the brood nest are normal, turn the heating lamp on, they get dangerously high, up above 42 degrees centigrade. Water collectors stayed low for a while. So colony was cooling itself on its reserve water, but then after an hour, up it goes, and it gets high, and it stays up well after the heating lamp is off, but eventually cools off. I'm sorry, I was following the wrong line, wasn't I? Goes up, stays very high, and then it shuts down. And then this day, the nectar collection is going along. It's a little higher than the previous one. It goes up a little bit during the day, but doesn't jump up, and it goes down, but that's at the end of the day. It's just dropping down. So the point is that a colony is able to turn on and turn off the water collection as needed. Now, I do want to hammer home this, or do want to address carefully this question. Does a rise in water collection cause a drop in nectar collection? I mean, do they have a limited supply of collectors? So if they turn up the water, they need to cut back on their nectar collection. The answer is a flat no. These are different parts of the economy. Water collection is done by different bees than the nectar collectors. And it probably, in the water spreading is done by different bees than are handling the nectar. You can see that in one of these experiments, we took time out, a different experiment. But we would start again with the temperature and the lamp off, and normal temperatures from the brood nest, and we measured the forager traffic, the water collector traffic, and the nectar collecting traffic. And so in this experiment, in that period of time, water collecting was low. 0.4 bees per minute were coming into the hive with water. And nectar collectors, that traffic level was also low. It was moderate, 13.9. You might wonder, well, how do you know who the water collectors and the nectar collectors are? Well, we didn't know all of the nectar collectors, so what we had to do is we would just sample bees coming in the tunnel into the hive and then squeeze them to see what they had. And that's how we knew that got these rates. Water low, 0.4 bees, nectar high, basically 14 bees per minute. Then we'd heat up the hive where we couldn't, and we did not collect any data because we wanted to have the colony go into heat stress for a while. And then here we go, here we've got the heat stress on, and now at the end of this period of time, some 1, 2, 3 hours of heat stress, now we measure again the forager traffic. And now you can see there's a lot of water collection. It was a big heat stress. High temperatures in the hive for a long time. Now it's 18.2 bees per minute are bringing in water compared to 0.4 before. But there's no change in the rate of nectar collection. It's not dropped and it's not increased. It's essentially the same here, 12.6 as it was there. So these are really, the water collection is modulated independently of the nectar collection. And thus they don't use nectar for cooling, evidently. Rise in water collection cause a drop in nectar collection? No. Didn't trigger a drop in nectar collection. And again, water collectors and nectar collectors are distinct, which I think is pretty cool. But the main thing I want to stress here is we've seen this adaptive control of water collection, but remember the key question here was, how does a water collector know when to stop collecting? How did these bees go from this situation here, where there's a lot of water collectors per minute, here, down to here? Or here, down to here. How did they put the brakes on the water collection. How did those water collectors know that they didn't need to keep collecting? Well, there's a lot of things let's look at exactly what those water collectors are experiencing as they go through the transition from water collecting being the need going up and then it going down. These are behavioral data from one water collector. These are representative, but they are typical for water collectors. And the question here is, does a drop in a colony's need for water make it harder for the water collectors to get unloaded? And we'll see, yes. The answer is definitively yes. They come in, they've got their water, but if the colony doesn't need water, they get the message. We're not sure exactly how, but a lot of things change. And let's go through what the evidence is showing us. Again, we're going to have a period of time with the observation hive. We're going to be tracking one water collector, what she experiences. Now, initially in the hive, there's no heating of the brood nest in the hive, and we didn't actually take any data then. But we turned on the lamps, but we had labeled these water collectors in this colony the day before. And you can see that we turned the lamps on, and here's the temperature in the hive. It starts out nice and cool, around 35 degrees centigrade. But once the lamps are on, it quickly gets up well above 35, up near 40. And for a couple of hours, you can see this little water collector bee didn't collect water. The heating lamp went on at, looks like about 11:20. She started collecting at 12:43, an hour and 20 minutes later. So again, the colony was coping initially with the water reserves that it had in the water spreaders. She started collecting water at 12:43, and then what we measured, every time she came into the hive, this was tracking this one bee, focused on that one bee, these are her search times. How long did she have to search when she came in the hive to find somebody to take her water load? Well, it was less than 30 seconds. A few were up a little bit more than 30 seconds, but as long as that heating lamp was on, it didn't take her long to find somebody to take her water. And she would walk around in the nest. She'd come in, she'd run in with the water, she'd spread her mandibles, and she could see a little droplet of liquid between her mandibles. So she was offering, and she would go from bee to bee. And not every bee wants water. So she experienced a lot of unloading rejections. And this is because she couldn't tell who was a water receiver and who was a nectar receiver. So a lot of bees would put out their tongue, evidently taste that she had water, not nectar, and then quickly fold their tongues back under, like, that's not my business. So she experienced a lot of unloading rejections, as well as experiencing a short search time. But she still had to search, because she couldn't tell who was a water receiver and who was a nectar receiver. So she was getting unloading rejections. And this was her delivery time. This is the time it took her, total time from, I've forgotten how that was measured, whether it was, I think it was the time from when she came in the hive to when she finished her delivery. So her delivery time was down around a little more than 60 seconds, as long as the heating lamp was on. But notice what happens when the heating lamp goes off. Well, initially nothing changes. For a while, the colony is still coping with all the heat that it had accumulated in the hive when the lamp was on. So for a while, her search times are low, but then they start getting longer and longer and longer. And finally, at 3:46, she stops collecting water. She's just had it. She's come in, she's had these long searches. She's come in, and initially, again, her unloading rejections are relatively small, but then they get longer and longer. Initially, they were what, less than 5 or so back here? Now, as the colony recovered from the overheating, she was getting 20 or 30 or 40 unloading rejections. And again, by the time she gave up, she had experienced 40 unloading rejections. Didn't continue. And here's her delivery time. It also gets longer and longer and longer. So there's a whole set of things that are changing as the colony's temperature drops and it recovers from that heating stress. And the question is, which of these things, which is she paying attention to? Is it one of them, some combination of them? It's really hard to say whether she's paying more attention to search time, unloading rejections, or delivery time. But what I can say is the thing that changes most markedly, if you look at the ratio of the values of what she was experiencing when the heat stress was on compared to what she was experiencing when the heat stress is off, the thing that changes most markedly is the number of unloading rejections. That doesn't prove that that's what she's paying attention to, but if she was trying to do an optimal measurement of change in the need for water, that's what she should key in on. And this just shows these ratios of the values when the heat is off and these things get high, like search time or total search time or delivery time or unloading rejections, divided by when the heat was on. And you can see that the ratio for unloading rejections is about 9 to 1 between those two conditions. Whereas for these other variables, it's also very strong. It's about 5 to 1, 4 to 1. But I think this is a piece of evidence that suggests that this one is the most striking thing. If she was trying to do an optimal sampling or measurement, she would pay attention to unloading rejections. One thing that's clear she doesn't pay attention to, because it doesn't change, is how many bees simultaneously unload her. And I didn't explain that, but when a bee comes in with a load of water, there might be just one bee that has her tongue out and is taking her water load, or it could be 2 or 3, sometimes even 4 bees will unload a bee. But that actually doesn't change you can see that variation, but it doesn't change markedly between those two conditions. So we know that's not important. So what have we learned about these water collectors? Well, we've learned that colonies precisely control their water intake. We've also learned that water collectors are elderly bees and the water receivers are middle-aged bees. We have seen that a water collector starts work when she's strongly begged or is highly thirsty for water, some combination or either one of those two or the combination of the two. And we see that a water collector stops her work when she has difficulty finding a receiver willing to unload her. Quite exactly how she measures that lack of willingness to be unloaded, whether it's how long it takes to find a bee or how many rejections she experiences, isn't clear, though the evidence points to those number of just rejections you get. And also interestingly, we've seen that the water collection, increased water collection, doesn't disrupt nectar collection. Water collectors and nectar collectors are distinct groups. It's distinct parts of the colony's physiology. So that's as far as we've taken this story. So I want to just leave you with a little water collector thanking you for your interest and attention.
Thank you. Tom, you're brilliant not only at pure research, but applied research, which is why we love you so much.
Thank you.
We've been in discussion about what's the best type of material to use for hive construction and its optimum thickness insofar as hive insulation is concerned. Can the number of water collectors be used as a judgment or an indicator of the effectiveness of various types of hive insulation?
Yeah, I never thought about that, but that looking at the rate of water collection and thus is certainly a good indicator of the water or thermal stress the colony is experiencing. So that could be an interesting assay to look at the same colony under different levels of insulation, and I bet it would really affect the water collection and as a readout of the water stress. That's a great suggestion. Thank you very much. Haven't done that. Will do.
I had a question about why you get these subgroups in a hive and how they are selected, whether it goes right back to some gene type that is a water collector, and then do the water receivers become the water collectors, and is the begging of the water collectors started by the water receivers?
First question. Yeah, what makes a bee a water collector versus a nectar collector? There has been some work on this. There's a strong genetic factor in that. Bees have these inherent preferences for different levels of sweet when they're collecting fluids. And yeah, the water collectors are the bees that have actually prefer the low energy, the dilute, the watery stuff. So yeah, that is part of the story. Whether that also is the same for the water receivers, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if that is part of the story. What was the third question you had?
Well, whether the begging is actually coming from the water receivers.
Yeah.
So when there's water stress, is it the water receivers that do the begging?
Yeah. Thank you. I believe it is. In that particular experiment, when we were working in the glass house and we were looking at the increase in the begging rate, I didn't have the water receivers labeled, so I can't answer. But my hunch would be yes, that water begging. Because I think what's going on is those bees that are the water receivers are the bees that are also heavily involved in the cooling of the brood nest. But I'm just guessing there. That's just my hunch. I have to. Good question. Good topic to investigate further. Because yeah, we know so little about water economy in a colony, and that would be a really good thing to know. Yeah.
I've got a question about the quality of water because. Yeah. When I watch my bees collecting water, they go for water which, as a different species entirely, I wouldn't want to
Yeah.
drink because of the pathogens in it. Do they have a mechanism for purifying water, or, I mean,
Yeah, water quality.
yeah, water quality?
Yeah, it is interesting, though. Yeah, I think we've probably all seen bees collecting water solutions that don't look very appealing, but they do need. It's an interesting point that the bees do need minerals as well, and like all herbivores, their diet, they're eating pollen and nectar. Those are the main things. Those are very short on minerals, especially sodium, and so that's one of the main reasons they like to go out and collect some water that looks filthy to us. And yeah, it's a striking phenomenon that they will go out and collect these salt. People have done these studies now. There's a young woman who's done a study for her PhD on this very topic, and it's sodium in particular. It's not potassium they're going at. It's not chloride that they're going after. It's mostly sodium. But that's exactly what herbivores, and it's not just bees, but a lot of insects that are herbivores. Many butterflies and moths will puddle for salt solutions too.
There's a question at the back, please.
Yes, excellent studies you've done. Were you able to notice the bees taking advantage of condensation within the hive in any of your studies?
Yes. Thank you for asking that question, because I think it actually gets at an important point. I haven't seen firsthand the use of condensation, mostly because except in a few cases in an early chilly morning, when we start heating the hive, we will see that the bees are drinking. If it's an ops hive in the field, there can be condensation on the glass, and we will see first thing in the morning when that condensation is there, as we heat the hive, bees going for that condensation. So yeah, they do. Whether that's the water collectors, probably not. It's probably the water receivers just taking a shortcut and getting water in a handy location in the hive. And it points out that something that we don't know is just how important condensation is for meeting the water economy of bees in the winter. I think in our climate, I bet the bees rely heavily on condensation as a water source. Because when you think about it, they're subsisting all winter long on this 80+% sugar solution. That's not meeting their water needs. And so their water needs are probably met through condensation, probably from their respiration. So we tend to think of condensation in a hive as a bad thing, and maybe in some situations it is not good for them, but maybe in most times it's actually an important part of their overwintering physiology.
It's sort of two questions, but it's really the same question. I noticed in your diagram you showed the bees spreading water in occupied cells. Do they actually spread the water in the tops of unoccupied cells? And related to that is, have you disconnected the heat response from the relative change in relative humidity? I.e., have you tried using a desiccant rather than using a heater?
Yeah, no, I haven't. Generally, when you heat something, you do also desiccate it. You drive down the relative humidity, unless there's a lot of water available. So we haven't separated those two things. And where are they applying the water? That's another. You've put your finger on another unknown. Whether they're selectively putting the water spreaders or selectively cooling the cells containing brood. I wouldn't be surprised. Bees are very smart. I mean, they're very well adapted little animals. But nobody's looked at that. Good question to future, and I should take notes.
G'day, thank you. You were saying about being more stressed for water in winter. Did the bees actually come out and use snow or utilise ice or things for the water supply during the winter?
If it's warm enough for them to fly out, indeed they will, yeah. And that's mentioned at the beginning. That's when I've seen the most vigorous, long-lasting waggle dances. And that's a good measure of a bee's desire or reporting of the attractiveness of something going out in the winter. Sunny day, warm enough to fly.
You said that there were two main reasons for collecting water: to cool the hive and to feed the brood.
Right.
We are also animals, and if we are in the Sahara, we physically need ourselves more water than if we're in the Arctic. Do
Yeah.
bees individually not need more water when it's hot? And if so, where do they get it from?
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't want to leave the impression that the individual's water balance is not important. That's fundamental, and I think it's how these bees know, be it whether you're a water spreader or maybe, but also maybe as a water collector, what the need for the water is. I think my hunch of what goes on is the water spreaders spread out their water, and they may get very thirsty because they're using up whatever fluids they've got in their crop to cool off, so they don't have a way to, that can generate thirst in their own body. And then also for the water collectors have given up their water. That may also translate into a personal thirst. And ultimately, it is going to come down to something the bees experience themselves personally, either the water spreaders or the water collectors, that is telling them that they need more water. It's possible that it's the high temperatures in the hive, but I suspect it's their own personal thirst.
The foragers that fly around in the heat
Yeah.
must lose a lot of water themselves. Do they not need it as well?
Yeah, they do. There's work by a gentleman named Bernd Heinrich that's looked at what bees do when they fly at nectar foragers do when they fly at very high temperatures. And they regurgitate the nectar they're collecting. They spread it on their head to cool, and that's their radiator for dumping body heat when they're flying at very high temperatures. The water and nectar, which is largely water, is used in the foraging activity too.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, has the studies been done in warmer climates? If you're saying that the need for water goes up in winter because they can't forage and there's no nectar or less nectar out there, if they're in a climate that they can forage in winter and fly more in winter, does the same need for water go up, or it's not the same?
I think it would probably not go up as high in a warm climate when they can forage year-round or more often. I think it's these bees that are in our northern climates, which are confined, can't go out, but are still eating food and as with all respiring animals, giving off water from their respiration. I think they're the ones that have they get the thirstiest, the biggest water stress, simply because they can't go out and get fresh water. But maybe the condensation in the hive is really a simple solution to that.
I was just wondering if during times of water stress, if bees can use nectar in the same way, and do they go out and look for weaker solutions of nectar to compensate?
No, there's no evidence that they go out during a water stress and the nectar collectors will seek more dilute solutions of nectar. It looks like there's a real partitioning of these parts of the colony's economy, and when they need water, they're not going to sacrifice the efficiency of their nectar collection by seeking more dilute solutions. That was one of the things Martin Lindauer looked at.
I have read that sometimes bees would fill, can you hear me? Bees can sometimes fill certain cells with water, basically creating a sort of reservoir to dip into if they need it. Did you find that confirmed during your research, or is that just a myth?
I don't think it's a myth. That was reported in South Africa. Studies done in South Africa where I think the water stresses are extreme, and those bees maybe have special adaptations for dealing with their very dry climate. Our bees, except in the winter, our bees have the luxury of almost always being able, during the daytime at least, to have plentiful supplies of water. I haven't seen that. We didn't see that even in the greenhouse. I didn't mention this, but even at the end of those days when we put colonies through big water stresses, we sampled the cells that contained liquid. We never found any cells stuffed with water in our hive, but I do believe the evidence from South Africa, and I think there may have been a study in Arizona, again, a very harsh climate where water stresses are extreme and perhaps persistent. I think that is part of the bee's repertoire, at least in certain locations.
Hi, over here. You touched on the fact that collectors can't tell who are nectar receivers or water receivers.
Evidently.
And I just wondered whether or not the receivers know which bees go out and do the collecting of water.
No, I don't think the receivers know it either. And the evidence for that is we see all of these bees coming up to water collectors, putting out their tongue, and in a microsecond later, evidently they've tasted and said, no thanks, and then they fold their tongue back under. So I don't think, you might think they could though, because if you go to a water source, you don't come back with the fragrance of flowers on you. So you would think that they might be able to do that, but evidently they don't, or at least they don't do it perfectly.
Come back with the fragrance of farmyards.
Right, yeah. Yeah. But you know, it's really a subject that should be examined more closely, because I never underestimate the bee.
Yes, when you squeeze a bee for its nectar content or water content, how does the bee react? Does it aid?
Yeah.
But does it get aggressive? Does it realize what's happened and go back into its source, or does it carry on? What's it do?
We just, what I do, I'll explain the method first, and then you'll understand. You grab the bee by her wings, and then so one hand is holding her, my right hand's holding her by her wings, so she can't move around too much. She can't fly away. And then I use wide-bladed forceps, and I squeeze her abdomen. It doesn't damage the bee, as far as I can tell. At least the bees are healthy. She regurgitates onto the plate of the refractometer, thank you. And, and then I put her back at the hive entrance, and she scuttles in the hive. So she doesn't seem to be terribly upset. That said, they do release alarm pheromone. So yes, they realize that she's being mishandled.
Do you squeeze them laterally or?
Oh, dorsoventral squeezing. Yeah. And some bees, if they have a full crop filled with nectar or water, it just rushes out and it spreads over the refractometer plate. Other bees just have tiny little loads, and so, but even those little ones you can usually measure. I didn't record that. It's a little harder thing to get the volume measurements, but you can do that too. Probably the best way to get the volume would be to weigh the bee before and after the squeezing.
Thank you. As water is so necessary for bees, why don't we feed them water with a water feeder?
Some people do in hot climates make sure they have water sources, but generally in our climate, I think it's probably more efficient for us, as perhaps also for the bees, just to let them do their own thing. Yeah, and that's most places around here, and water is plentiful. I can find little streams, and so they just go out and do it. And it's really you know, on a day like today, I don't know if they'd need a lot of water. It's so cool, but yeah.
I was thinking more during the winter.
Oh, in the winter, yeah. I think we don't. That's an open question whether it would be helpful or whether there's just enough condensation in the hive. I think there's open question there too.
I found it very interesting that there was a delayed response in water collection.
Yes.
To the rise in temperature.
Yeah.
My response to overheating is fanning. Did you see any fanning going on in the hive?
Yeah,
in that period?
That's right. The overheating, the response to overheating involves both the ventilation, or fanning, as well as the water spreading. When the overheating started, and the overheating in these experiments, those heat lamps raise the brood comb temperatures very quickly. So yes, almost from the get-go, as soon as the lamps are on, bees are fanning and spreading water. But they were able to cope with the liquids that are right in the hive for the first 30 minutes to an hour. And that's, yeah. Yep.
Can I try one?
Sure.
If my bees are making a nuisance of them by visiting someone else's swimming pool,
right.
Is there anything I can do to tempt them away?
The only solution I've found, Bob, to that is to move my hives, because and I've had exactly that issue. I don't have a swimming pool, but once I had a bee yard near a swimming pool, and it was a problem, and I just had to move the apiary.
Tom, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you for your question.